High up on a south slope of the Blue Ridge in Transylvania County, below a raggedy black rock called the Devil's Courthouse, is spectacular Courthouse Falls. When I first saw these falls, I thought, what a fine place to start a river. From here, as hemlock sentinels tower above, the waters of Courthouse Creek fly into a fluted chute and fall away over a boulder field of former falls, on down the mountain to become the North Fork of the French Broad River. The North Fork meets the west, middle, and east forks just a few miles below here, all near the tiny town of Rosamond. And then the united French Broad gentles along a wide farm valley. The Cherokee called the French Broad Long Man, the river, and all the streams he pulled in from beside him, among them the Davidson and the Mills, the Swannanoa, Nolichucky, and the Pigeon, were, in the words of the natives, his chattering children. This was the first of the wide streams or broads the old-time huntsmen met that flowed away from the ocean they or their parents had crossed and ran instead north and west into what was then French territory. Once, canoeing below Rosamond, I saw cascades of pink roses, blackberry blossoms, red-winged blackbirds, swallows in the riverbanks, a little green heron, and rounding one bend, I came upon a groundhog just standing there, watching the river flow. Celebrated author Wilma Dykeman tells us all about this river in her classic 1955 book, The French Broad. She tells how 130 years ago, in the 1870s, U.S. Senator Zeb Vance's brother, Congressman Robert Vance, got thousands of federal dollars poured into trying to make the Upper French Broad navigable for steamship traffic between Brevard and Asheville. Zeb was against it, and so was the senator from Ohio who swore not even a catfish can navigate the French Broad River. Maybe so, but that didn't stop the French Broad Steamship Company from launching a side-wheel steamboat back upriver at Brevard. They called her the Mountain Lily, and she made one short sightseeing trip, maybe two, before a torrent back up in the mountains tore her loose from her moorings, stove her into a sandbar, ruined, never to rise again. Nowadays, mostly what you'll see are the small craft of the French Broad Yacht Club, whose exclusive membership is limited to everyone who ever floated a boat on this river. Thomas Wolfe of Asheville wrote in Look Homeward Angel of a different late 19th century development, right near where the Swannanoa River flows into the French Broad. He said, several rich men from the north had established hunting lodges in the hills, and one of them had bought huge areas of mountain land, and with an army of imported architects, carpenters, and masons, was planning the greatest country estate in America, something in limestone, with pitch slate roofs, modeled on the Chateau at Blois. Wolfe was reporting, fictionally of course, on tycoon George Washington Vanderbilt's little Buncombe County getaway. A bit of the Loire here in the land of the sky. At 250 rooms, America's largest home, Biltmore. One natural event they still speak of hereabouts was the great French Broad River flood of July 1916, cresting at over 23 feet in Asheville. Bridges, factories, houses, and livestock washed away as the French Broad scoured its valley. Of this calamity, Thomas Wolfe wrote, Flood in Altamont. It began to rain, rain incessant. Spouting torrential rain fell among the reeking hills, leaving grass and foliage drowned upon the slopes, starting the liquid avalanche of earth upon a settlement, flooding lean Rocky Mountain streams to a foaming welter of yellow flood. It mined the yellow banks away with unheard droppings. It caved in hillsides. It drank the steep banked earth away below the rails, leaving them strung to their aerial ties across a gutted canyon. Writer Edmund Kirk said in Lippincott's magazine, December 1884, that Marshall is without doubt the only finished town in the United States. Built along a narrow shelf of land between the river and the mountain ridge, it has no room for expansion. Author Wilma Dykeman quoted a Prohibition-era lawman named Jesse James Bailey as describing Marshall another way: a block wide, a mile long, sky high, and hell deep. The sheriff was acknowledging that Civil War strife and later moonshine shootouts had earned his county the unenviable nickname of Bloody Madison. Nowadays, it's not white lightning, it's white water that is caught on with people thirsty for adventure, thanks in no small part to the folks at RiverLink who have helped clean this river up. Below Asheville, the French Broad leaves its high, flat, quiet water self behind and tumbles down a broad-shouldered Rocky Bluff gorge, past Alexander, Marshall, Barnard, and Hot Springs for 43 miles to Paint Rock at the Tennessee line, over which course it falls more than 700 feet. The Cherokee called the rapids Takayosti, where they race. There are 9 rapids to be dealt with in the 8-mile section of river, the French Broad's steepest, between Barnard and Hot Springs. Champion paddler Wendy Gordon once coolly called the ledges a 500 yards rush through ledges and waves that focuses your attention and elevates your heart rate. In the 19th century, most of the French Broad's traffic was not so much on the river as alongside it and bound upriver instead of down. By the 1830s and 40s, a stream of stock, hogs, cattle, mules, turkeys, even ducks, was boiling up out of the pasture lands of the lower French Broad in Tennessee and using the river in its gorge as the easiest way to South Carolina, to slaughterhouses in Spartanburg and markets in Charleston. Hot Springs has only been hot for a little over a century. Before that, the springs in town were called warm springs, widely reputed to be restorative more for their mineral qualities than their heat. But when the Grand Resort Hotel burned in the mid-1880s, the building of its successor occasioned an upward reappraisal of the spring's temperature. Warm became hot. Some said what warmth there was may have owed its heat not to geothermal activity, but to friction. Waters of the French Broad, siphoned off upriver of here, were thought to push briskly through narrow subterranean fissures and heat themselves, if mildly, during their clandestine transits. Though that spa scene has faded, there are still a few footprints in Hot Springs from those old days. Sunnybank, once a small hotel and guest house, sits on the corner of Walnut and Bridge. And though the great Mountain Park Hotel that Colonel J.H. Rumbaugh built in the 1880s fell to fire in the 1920s, the Colonel's mansard-towered home not only stands but currently glistens, put back to right as, what else? A bed and breakfast. Bypassed when the nation's interstate system adopted the gorge of the Pigeon River rather than that of the French Broad as the way to Knoxville, Hot Springs just about closed up for several decades. But these days, the town is on the rise again. For here, the Appalachian Trail bridges the French Broad. And here, in this little corner of Carolina, paddle culture meets the boot world in spades. If Hot Springs is hot, this crossroads of sport is why. Below Hot Springs, the French Broad River flows past Paint Rock and on out of North Carolina, winding its way to the Holston River, and with the Holston forming the Tennessee, and then rolling on toward the mighty Mississippi, where the waters of the Cherokee's long man at last meet Venerable Old Man River himself.